right, we're gonna conquer the moon glow. This is one of my favorite effects. It creates like a glowy haze around the moon. And there's two ways to do this, and the way I go about it depends on the size of the painting that I'm doing. So with something this small, I will wet the entire thing just like we did wet into wet. So I wet the entire thing except for the moon and do it that way. But when you're working with a bigger painting, it's kind of impossible to wet it all and then go wet into wet because things will start to dry. So I'm going to show you two ways to do this, and we'll start with wet on wet. Okay, so of course, first thing, I'm going to wet the area around the moon. Okay, got my circle wet, except for the moon. And just so you know, you don't have to come perfectly around the moon because we will add water back into that area anyway. And you also don't have to do this in a circle if it's, you know, challenging for you to come around all these curves here. Just do it in a blob or a square or whatever. You can do it any way you want. So I got my circle wet. I'm going to switch down to a 6. You could use a 4. You could really even use an 8. And the first thing I'm going to do is go into my darkest color. So for this one, the darkest color that I'm using is black. It's Ivory Black by Cotman. So I'm going to grab a healthy bit of this wet paint. And I'm going to start farthest away from the moon. So down here, and you can see how that will start to move and travel. Exactly what we want it to do. So because I've got less space up here in between my edge of my circle and my moon, I'm going to drop down to my number 4 because I'm working with a smaller space and I don't want my brush to hold as much water. So I just grab a little paint and I'm going to come around the top here. May need a little more water. It's not flowing good enough. So just making a smaller section of the dark paint above the moon. Now I'm going to switch back to my 6 and I'm going to go into my next color, which is Phthalo Blue. This one happens to be by Daniel Smith, but most companies make a phthalo blue and they're all very similar. And I'm going to start to hug the edge of where that black has exploded into the water. And I do a little touch and release, just getting really watery paint, and these two colors are going to start to mingle and merge with each other. And as I come up here, I don't want quite as much to mingle, so just using less water. And once I get that in, I rinse my brush off, I dab it a little bit, and now I'm just using water. And I'll do this in little sections, so I rinse, dab, and I'll start pulling in color to make a ring around the moon. Okay, so now my circle now is like really saturated, really wet, because I wet it first and then I've been adding all this paint and water. So I'm actually going to skip down to my number 2 and start to just clean up right around the moon. So just adding a little clean water and cleaning up some of the edges. And remember, I do it in little sections, so I constantly clean, dab. Okay, so now I'm going to grab my third color that I'm using. You really could just use 2, or you can use more than 3. This color is Mauve by Cotman. So I'm going to grab some of this with my number 2, and I'm going to start to go right around that ring. So not right next to the moon. I'm actually like creating a glow around the moon. And you do this in sections as well. So I'll grab a little paint and I'm touching and releasing in a ring around the moon. I can come back and saturate some areas. And now I'm just going to start to manipulate a little bit, just with a slightly damp brush. I'm just kind of pulling that mauve out into that blue a little bit. And I can also come in with water and push with water, push back at that mauve so that it continues to stay away from my moon, creating the glow around the moon. And don't forget also, if you want to do some burst star effects, you just grab a little clean water. Anything that's wet, you can just drop a little water and it will push some of the pigment away. And later on you can make those into stars. So there you go. That's how I create the glow around the moon, going wet into wet. Okay, this is dried, and now I'm gonna show you how I paint the moon. So sometimes I will get a picture of the moon to kind of help with inspiration, but the main thing to remember is that you're basically painting a ball. So if you think about and that ball, the moon, the sun is shining on it, and that's what makes it glow, right? So if you think about if a light was shining on a ball and think about where the shadows would be, it would kind of be in a curve. And if you look at pictures of the moon, a lot of the times this side is much darker than this side. And there's a lot of little craters and uneven surfaces in the moon. So all I'm doing is putting just a small amount of water, and I'm doing it much more water on the left side here. I just have a little over here. And then I just pick up some colors that I used in my painting. So for this, I'm going to pick up just a little blue. And you can see how I add water to my puddle here to make the paint a little lighter. I don't want it to be quite that dark, so add a little water. And then I just drop it into some areas that I wet, and just kind of let it do what it wants to do. And I'll drop down to my number 2, and I'm also going to grab just a little mauve and just drop that right on top in a couple of places. Rinse off, and then I just kind of feather some of these edges, bring some of it to the very edge of the moon. I just kind of let it do what it wants to do. And my big trick is I take a piece of paper towel, I bundle it up, and I just blot out some areas. And once you do that, if you come back in and just clean up a few areas just by applying some clean water and fix up some of your hard edges, ta-da, there's your moon. So pretty easy. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the process of adding stars into my sky, and I'm also going to add a tree right here just so you can see how that's done as well. Okay, so I've got some stars in there, and now I'm going to give a couple of them a glow effect. And I'm gonna add a tree right here. So the way that I do this, maybe actually I'll start with the blue. So I'm just grabbing a little blue with my small brush, my number 2, and I start by placing the trunk. So just lightly put in a trunk, and then I start feathering out, just using the tip, very tip of your brush, and you're just kind of dotting back and forth, almost in like a zigzag pattern. And then the tree will get wider as you go down. I'm going to grab a little mauve, put that right into that blue because I'm trying to make the tree pretty dark. And it just gets wider and wider as you go down, and it will just disappear into the darkest part there. He looks a little lonely. I think we need another tree. So I'm going to grab some more blue, and I like to vary the height. And the paint that I'm using on my brush is not as watery as what I typically paint with because I'm trying to get the tree to be pretty dark. And this is the one time also where I will mix paints right on my palette. There we go. Looks better with a friend there. So there you go. You just created a whole world for yourself. We added in the moon, we added some stars, and gave the moon some tree neighbors. So next we'll do the same exact process, but we'll do it on a dry paper instead of wet. Alrighty, for this next one, we're going to do the same thing, but this time we're going to go wet paint onto dry paper. And this is a technique that I would use if I had a larger piece to paint. So we're going to pretend that this is a larger space, but definitely when you practice it, start small. Okay, so I'm going to get started. I'm going to use the same paint colors. So starting off with my darkest, which is the Ivory Black by Cotman. Get that good and wet. And you really want to make sure that you have fairly wet paint when you're working wet into dry. It's amazing how fast the watercolor paper dries. And all the process starts and finishes pretty much the same way. You're just adding water as you go. So this part is exactly the same, but the paint doesn't flow because it doesn't have any water to go into. But we're still gonna lay down this dark part first. So I got that nice and dark and watery. And now I'm going to go into my phthalo blue, get it good and watery, and start to mingle these two colors together. And remember to do it in sections. So rinse your brush off a little. I'm going to drop down to a smaller brush because I'm going to come up here just like we did last time. And rinse off my brush, and now I'm just using clean water to come make a ring around the moon. Rinse off again and dab a little bit, and now I'm going to start to pull in sections into the moon. Okay, so now I will go down to my number 2, and I'm going to clean that up a little because it got blue in it. Start to grab some of my mauve, and I'm going to make a ring around the moon with that. And I think I'm going to drop a little mauve in a couple of places for some different star looks. And I'm just going one brush up. I'm actually going to a 4 because I'm going to add a little extra water right around the moon. You could do it with a 2 just as easily, but I really want to create that glow. So that water is pushing back against that mauve. And there you have it. That is creating a moon glow effect working with a dry paper. And we'll compare the two when they're finished, but as you can see, it's really the result is very similar. And there we go. So there's the two side by side. Really, really similar. And that's our techniques. Wet into wet, wet into dry.